Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to The Advocates, the PBS Fight of the Week. Tonight's debate is coming to you from the studios of KTLA in Hollywood, California.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?
Moderator Edmund Semerjian has just called tonight's meeting to order.
Good evening and welcome to The Advocates. Tonight's debate deals with the size and effectiveness of government, and specifically our question is this: should your state adopt a constitutional amendment to limit state spending? California Republican State Senator John Harmer says yes.
The growth of state government is out of control. The legislature won't stop it, so the people must, by the adoption of a constitutional amendment that will limit state spending. With me here tonight to argue for this principle is Governor Ronald Reagan and Dr. Milton Friedman.
Howard Miller, professor of law at the University of Southern California, says no.
This proposal has all the glitter of fool's gold. It restricts state spending to limit state income taxes paid by the wealthy and shifts costs to local taxes paid by the average person. With me tonight to oppose this proposal are the Speaker of the California Assembly, Bob Moretti, and former Governor of California, Edmund G. Pat Brown.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll be back to your cases in a moment, but first let me welcome our Los Angeles audience and members of the California and national press who are here covering tonight's debate. It should be explained to those of you in our television audience outside of California that tonight we'll present the first head-on debate between the major supporters and opponents of a proposal that's the #1 political issue in California at this moment, and one that may soon be affecting your state. Next week, the people of California will go to the polls to vote on a proposed constitutional amendment that its supporters say should limit the size of government by limiting the amount of money government can spend. While this is a California proposal, it's offered as a model for other states and perhaps the federal government as well. Proposition 1 on the ballot here in California is a complex 5,000-word amendment to the state constitution, but the essential elements of the plan are these. Under the plan, a ceiling is placed on total state spending. In any year, spending by the state government cannot exceed a fixed percentage of the total income of the people of the state. In California, for example, when fully in effect, the limit on spending would be around 7% of total income. To raise the percentage spending limit, a constitutional amendment approved by the people would be required. In an emergency proclaimed by the governor and approved by the legislature, there could be a temporary increase. But this would expire unless ratified by the voters at the next statewide election. The plan does not alter existing laws covering local sales taxes, nor does it limit property taxes for schools. And let me emphasize that although this question is on the ballot next week in California, it's of great concern to people all over the United States. And now to the cases. Senator Harmer, why should your state adopt a constitutional limit on state spending?
Most of us are accustomed to having politicians tell us why they should spend more of our money. Tonight, Governor Reagan and I are going to tell you why government is spending too much of your money and that somehow this must stop. We have a history of this problem that is almost incredible. In 1930, government was taking from the income of every American taxpayer some 15 cents. By 1950, this had increased to some 30 cents. Today, government is taking out of your pocket 44 cents of every dollar of your income. That means that you work 5 months a year for the government before you have a nickel left to spend for yourself. And if the process continues, it will not be long before government will be taking more than half of your income. Now, out here in California, we can't do anything about federal spending, but we can do something in our state, just like you can in yours, about local and state spending. That's why we've developed a constitutional amendment that will limit the rate of increase of the growth of state government. That way, you will have more of your money to spend at your discretion. This plan doesn't require the cutting of any vital state services. The principle is very simple. The smaller slice of a bigger pie gives you more money. And because of the natural increase in the aggregate wealth of the state of California, as the pie grows bigger, a smaller slice provides yet more money to run the state. Today, the state government of California takes approximately 8.5 cents, or 8.5%, of the income of the people of the state of California for its budget, which is roughly $10 billion. Under this proposal, that amount of money that the state can take will be limited to 7%, and thus by 1990, the state will still have, with a 7% slice of the pie, $27 billion to run the state. We think that tripling the state budget in 16 years is more than adequate to provide for vital state services. No one feels more strongly about this problem tonight than my first witness, the governor of the state of California, the Honorable Ronald Reagan. Governor Reagan.
Governor, welcome to the Advocates.
Thank you. Governor, you've just heard about the incredible growth of government. Just what is wrong about big government? Why is it so dangerous?
Well, when government gets too big, freedom is lost. Government is supposed to be the servant. But when a government can confiscate the earnings of the people with no restraint or no limit whatsoever on the amount that government takes, then government has become the master. And government's track record at problem solving is not all that good. As a matter of fact, too often, government doesn't solve the problems, it subsidizes them.
Well, Governor, just how is this proposition going to address itself to solving the problem?
Well, we think that we're proposing an economic bill of rights for every working man and woman in California. We will limit the percentage of the people's earnings that the government can spend. And the limit, will be high enough that it will sustain the present level of government services with the additional money needed to meet the costs of inflation and population increase, and with additional funding for new or expanded government programs. But we will reduce all of the taxes over a period of years without reducing government services.
Well, Governor, why a constitutional amendment? Can't you and the state legislature solve this problem?
Well, the record speaks for itself. Apparently the legislature can't. I signed the bills that have been passed and sent to my desk in the last 7 years, the billions of dollars in spending bills. The budget of California today would be more than $3 billion above its present level. And the state sales tax, for example, to fund that would have to be 11 cents instead of 6 cents. Or the income tax would have to be 2.5 times what it presently is. Now, why a constitutional amendment? Because that's what the Constitution is for. When government has broken beyond the bonds of restraint, when government is imposing unjustly on the people, then you have a constitutional amendment because the people take back that power into their own hands.
But Governor, on that very point, we're told that this constitutional amendment will emasculate the power of the legislature, that it will keep the legislature from being able to function effectively.
Not at all. It makes one change and one change only. It places a limit on the amount of money the government can tax. From there on, the government is in, or the legislature is in total control of manner of spending. In the tax structure, the government can, or the legislature can raise taxes, lower taxes, cancel taxes. It can pass new taxes. It can close loopholes.
How does this proposition, though, deal with such a thing as an emergency situation? Won't the hands of the legislature be tied?
Not at all. The legislature, there is provision in the measure for the legislature to have access to an emergency fund, a sizable fund, in that event, either an economic emergency or a natural disaster. And beyond that, the legislature has the power to raise the taxes above the constitutional limit to meet the emergency.
One more brief question.
Governor, we are told by the opposition that what we're really talking about is a shifting of the cost of government to the local taxpayer. Can you assure us that this proposition will not result in a shift to local government rather than just a limitation on spending?
This is not a tax shift. As a matter of fact, it makes it more difficult for local government to raise taxes. That's why some local government authorities are against it. This proposal says that if the state tries to mandate services or responsibilities on local government, the state has to pay for them, which the state has not done in the past. And this program makes it harder to raise local property taxes by freezing into the Constitution the provisions of a statute we presently have that limits local government's ability to raise property taxes.
All right, Governor. Mr. Miller is eager to ask you some questions. Mr. Miller?
Governor, I'm glad you ended on the note of the tax shift. because I think you left something out. This is the official state ballot that is appearing on the ballot in California, that is an official state document that describes your tax initiative. It states that under the initiative there will be a reduction in projected state program expenditures of $620 million in the first year to $1,366 million in the fourth year, and increasing thereafter, with probable substantial offsetting cost and tax increases to local government. That is in the official document of the state of California, the only thing that will be in front of the voter when he votes. Assuming that is true, should he vote yes on this proposition?
I'm sorry that he has to look at that in the ballot, because that's the so-called neutral analysis by the legislative analyst.
No,
and the legislative analyst's figures have been refuted, repudiated, and proven untrue.
No.
Instead of suffering $600 million loss next year, we already have the figures and are projecting a budget that can be, under the limitation, $600 million bigger than the present budget.
Well, Governor, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer. There are a large number of voters in the state who may believe what the state of California tells them on their ballot, and it is the only thing that faces them in the ballot booth. Now, the question is, for those voters who believe what the state of California has said is the initiative, should those voters vote yes?
I cannot answer your question in that way, Mr. Miller, because the truth of the matter is that statement is a proven falsehood, and we have protested to the Secretary of State about its being on the ballot.
Have you brought a lawsuit?
Yes, we have brought a lawsuit with regard to advertising, and that's a part of it.
No, you have not. And tell me, of the 100...
Well, Mr. Miller, can we get to the merits of the proposal and not bicker over what the wording of the ballot is?
Well, I think the wording of the ballot describes the merits of the proposal. Let me ask you this, Governor. Let me ask this, Governor. You, as Governor of California, have a line item veto. That means you have the power to cross out any particular item or reduce it that is presented to you for expenditure.
That's right.
In the last 7 years, the budget of the state of California has gone up from $3.8 billion to about $9 billion. Is there any item over those 7 years that you approved that you should not have approved?
Oh, sometimes there might be some that my own personal taste would have been no, but I believed in the legislative the right of the legislature, and when the overwhelmingly, bipartisanly, the legislature passed it, I felt that I should sign it. But I have also blue-penciled $1 billion out of the budget that has been added in by the legislature.
Now, let's be clear about the line item veto. You have the absolute power. Mm-hmm. When you took office, state spending was about 5.5% of state income. It is today 8.5% of personal income. You could have achieved this restriction on state spending simply by drawing a line through expenditures and signing your initials, yet you didn't do so.
Mr. Miller, may I just point out that would have been impossible.
Why?
Because I inherited a budget that was fraudulent, that in order to avoid a tax increase until after the 1966 election had 12 months spending based on 15 months revenue. The government was spending $1 million a day more than it was taking in.
Governor. Governor, you have these ads supporting Proposition 1. Take the politicians' hands out of your pockets. The truth of the matter is you have total control over spending. It is your hands that have been in the taxpayers' pockets. You approved every single expenditure over the last 7 years.
Well, Mr. Miller, may I answer you again? I also inherited a government that had a $4 billion unfunded liability hanging over every property owner in this state in the unfunded teachers' retirement program. Should I have line itemed out the very item I asked for of hundreds of millions of dollars a year to make that now an actuarially sound funded program?
Is it your testimony, Governor, that 8.5% of personal income is necessary to run the state of California? Because that's the budget you've approved.
No, because we corrected a runaway welfare situation that was spending 4 times as fast as revenues were increasing.
No, listen to the question.
Now,
You've
wait a
approved
minute. Yes, it is.
8.5%.
No, we now have gone from a budget that required an $800 million tax increase the first year we arrived to a situation of asking to give back to the people an $800 million surplus and to give them an ongoing tax cut, which we have secured through our economy.
No, this is
one brief question and answer.
Governor, may I remind you, this is 7 years later, and you have approved the budget of 8.5%. How could you have functioned as governor if there had been an amendment limiting expenditures to 7% when you yourself feel 8.5% was necessary in your budget?
Wait a minute. If there had been such a limitation before I became governor, I wouldn't have inherited a shambles in which the government was spending $1 million a day more than it was taking in.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Governor. Wait a minute, Governor. Mr. Harmer, you have another question.
Governor, if we take Mr. Miller literally, you must be the absolute dictator of California. But my question is this.
You may take me literally.
Governor, 2 years ago, the same person that wrote that ballot argument predicted dire consequences for the state of California if you didn't increase our taxes $800 million. You refused to do it and did something else, and what happened?
Well, it was the question of our welfare reforms, and we heard exactly the same kind of arguments from exactly the same people that we're hearing today. We were going to dump costs on local government, local property taxes were going to go up, county general relief was going to increase, and the state was going to end the year with a $700 million deficit. Well, we passed the welfare reforms. It's 2 years later. There are 368,000 fewer people on welfare in California. Local county relief went down instead of up. 42 counties reduced their property taxes last year. 45 reduced them this year. And the $700 million deficit became a $265 million surplus.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Governor. No, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Governor.
I have one more question. I have one more.
What? I'm sorry.
I call for my second witness, an internationally renowned economist from the University of Chicago, Dr. Milton Friedman.
Dr. Friedman, welcome to the Advocates.
Thank you. Dr. Friedman was a member of the task force which helped develop this proposition. He was a consultant to it. Dr. Friedman, was this task force with which you worked just another consulting job for you, or was there something special about it?
Very far from being just another job. I believe that the major problem which faces this country in the 1970s and 80s is how we stop the growth of government, how we prevent Leviathan from growing so big that it destroys our freedom and our ability to run our own lives. This initiative in California is, to my mind, the only measure taking place anywhere in this country that offers some real hope of stopping the growth of that gigantic government.
Dr. Friedman, why is it necessary for us to put a limit on government? What is it about the nature of government that makes it tend to increase in its costs?
There's a fundamental defect in our present democratic structure. That defect arises from the fact that the legislature, the government, approves individual programs, and that nobody takes a look at the whole. The result of that is that each one of us, when he's a special interest, yells loud. He goes to Sacramento, he goes to Washington, he spends a lot of time trying to get his program. That program means a lot to him. Maybe it means 50 cents more in taxes to you, $1 more to me. No one of us is going to go down and fight hard for that 50 cents and $1. The problem is that if you handle each item of expenditure separately, the sum of the pieces tends to be larger than we would want to spend if we looked at it as a whole.
Well,
the great virtue of this amendment, of this proposal, is that it gives the people, for the first time, an opportunity to look at the whole pie and decide how much of their income they want government to spend.
Well, you're telling us the special interests who look only at their part of the pie cause this increase. Surely you wouldn't assert that school children or old people are special interests, would you?
We are all of a special interest. The problem isn't vicious, nasty people. There are such people, but they aren't the problem. The problem are you and me. When you speak of school children, there are school children. We, in our capacity as parents, will act in one way. We may not like the tax bill when it comes home. We may, as parents, vote for something which, as taxpayers, if we add up what we voted for as parents, what we voted for as automobile drivers, what we voted for as this, is too much. And moreover, you know, not all special interests are equal. Some special interests are more equal than others. The school teachers are a special interest too, and they have managed over the course of the past few years to drive expenditures on schools up at a tremendous rate without any kind of a corresponding increase in quality.
Well, Dr. Friedman, what's this proposition going to do about these special interests? It's not going to make them disappear.
Oh, of course not. But it's going to force them to work in the public interest. Because if you set a limit on the total amount of spending, the special interests will have to fight against one another. rather than against the general public interest. The situation will be the same in government as it is for each of us separately. You don't decide how much to spend on A, B, C, and D, then add it up and say, well, that's how much income I've got. You start with a certain amount of money available to spend, and then you apportion it out. If you do the same thing on the state level, if you say the state government shall have a certain sum, then each special interest will have to demonstrate the virtue of its proposal by contrast with every other special interest.
Well, Dr. Friedman...
All right, thank you, Senator. I'm sorry to interrupt. Mr. Miller, you're a witness.
Dr. Friedman, I share your concern about special interests and also your joint statement that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Who are the special interests supporting this initiative?
There are many special interests on both sides of this initiative.
Who are those
I
that
took
are
a
favoring it?
look at the list of people, the list of organizations who were listed as opposed to the initiative and in favor of it. The list of organizations opposed to this initiative consists, for the most part, of public employees. You had the school teachers, you had the civil servants. Obviously, their special interest is to oppose this initiative because their special interest is to have larger state spending.
And who are the relatively few people who have raised over $1 million to qualify it for the ballot and advertise it to
And
be
the
passed?
special interest on the other side, as I looked at the organization, was the California Association of Taxpayers. The taxpayers are a very special interest. The important point, Mr. Miller, is that the only way in which we, as taxpayers, can become a special interest is by lumping together all the programs at once. This is the whole point.
Most of the money came from relatively.
It is in our special interest as taxpayers to oppose an increase in the total amount of taxes that we bear. It is not in our special interest as taxpayers to oppose each program separately.
Well, as a matter of fact, most of the money for the initiative came from relatively few people, and let me ask you why. Why does this initiative require a two-thirds vote to raise the income tax? Why does this initiative require a two-thirds vote to raise the income tax, which basically affects the wealthy payer in the state, but with a majority vote, the local sales or the property tax can be raised?
Excuse me. Will you tell me the two-thirds vote for the income tax, you have reference to income taxes imposed on local level?
No, on state.
Because
on state,
every change in a statewide tax requires a two-thirds vote under the initiative.
Well, let me make sure you've read the initiative.
I have read the initiative.
Under this initiative, it requires a two-thirds vote to raise the state income tax, but a majority vote for local sales. Now, why is that? Does that explain who the special interests are?
I would prefer to have a two-thirds vote to raise any kind of a tax. But let's look at the local sales. Let's look at the issue you're raising. The fact of the matter is that in order to raise the local sales tax, you both have to have a state legislature approve it.
By majority.
And you have to have the local community. And you have to have the local community
by
approve
majority.
It. Now, I have very little objection to having the local community impose whatever taxes it wishes on itself.
Except an income tax, which is barred.
Tell me, will you explain to me how many local communities in the state of California now have an income tax?
I will tell you that none do. This is the first provision that requires it, and throughout this provision to impose a tax on wealthier taxpayer requires a two-thirds vote, and to impose a tax on ordinary taxpayers involves a majority vote.
You are really bringing up a straw man of the straw. You are really bringing up an extremely shoddy straw man, because the fact of the matter is that no community in this state today, when the situation has been different than you've been painting it, has found it appropriate to impose
except the state of California.
No local community has found it appropriate to oppose an income tax. In the country as a whole, very few local communities have done so. Personally, I think it is highly desirable to have a relatively stable tax system. I do not think you ought to have tax systems that change from one year to the next. And therefore, I see no reason, in fact, I see a great advantage in requiring a two-thirds vote for any change in the tax system of any kind.
Let me ask you this.
Let me go on for one more point.
Let Mr. Miller ask you a question before you answer.
Okay, there's a budget here of questions as well. Let me ask you this. You really don't think very much of government at all. In your book on capitalism and freedom, you write that national parks ought to be run by private enterprise, doctors shouldn't be licensed by the state, Social Security has no governmental role. You don't care about restricting government expenditures because you really don't think government has much to do you?
Well, let's look. One of the things I also wrote for was eliminating the draft. I take it that was...
If your defense of your economic views is to say you must eliminate the draft, that's a very shallow defense on your tax views. Tell me about
The draft is a form of taxation, Mr. Miller.
Yes, so
it's a form of taxation in kind of servitude. The fact of the matter is that indeed most governmental programs do not achieve the objectives that the well-meaning people who support them are interested in. And the reason they don't is precisely the same special interest argument, because you may have a general interest in passing a program, but once that program gets passed, those of us who have a general interest go home and tend to our business, and the special interests come and take it over. That's why the Interstate Commerce Commission has been run by the railroads.
Make this a very brief answer.
Tell me about,
Doctor.
you say there should be no national parks, and one of the requirements of this initiative is that fees for state parks go up, turn them into a private kind of business. Tell me why the state should not be in the state park business, why Yellowstone, as you mentioned in your book in the Grand Canyon, ought not be a national park, but should be run by private enterprise.
I would be very glad to engage in a discussion about the national parks. However, that is not what this issue is about. This is a red herring that you are bringing over the trail.
Along with the straw man.
The fact of the matter is that this initiative provides the state of California with as much money as it is now spending on all state projects. It would not require a reduction in any activities in the state of California. Now, from my own personal point of view, I would much rather that the initiative required a still further reduction. I agree with you that much of what the government is now spending is waste.
So you don't agree?
And that the people would be better served if taxes and expenditures could be cut still more.
All right, Mr. Miller, let's go back to Senator Harmer.
We agree
for
on the
another
draft,
question.
but not the
Wait a minute, Mr. Miller. Back to Senator Harmer.
Dr. Friedman, you've been asked about everything but the proposition. So let me ask you now. Let me ask you now, as a non-Californian who has nothing personal to gain or lose by the passage of this, will this program work? Can it set a meaningful limitation upon the cost of state government without drastically reducing state services? And does it hold some national value?
Well, looking at it as objectively as I can as an outsider, there isn't the slightest doubt that the limits set in this initiative would provide a level of governmental services as high as is now being provided, and higher as California continues to increase at the rate at which it has been increasing over past years. So it is a very generous proposal from that point of view. It certainly can work. Whether it will work or not depends on whether the citizens of California feel strongly enough about it to make it want to work.
All right, thank you very much, Senator. Let's go back to Mr. Miller for one question.
Dr. Friedman, what if the ballot description is correct and it does require a reduction?
And when did you last beat your wife?
Wait a minute, Doctor. Let him ask the question.
The ballot proposition says you are beating your wife. Now, what if it is correct? What if it is correct and it requires a reduction? As a non-Californian, can you tell me what the percentage of state local assistance is to schools and how it will be affected?
Not as a Californian, but as someone who understands arithmetic, I have looked at the numbers in the proposal. There is no conceivable way in which those numbers, as they have been proposed in that program, can require a reduction from the present level in the expenditures on state services. What you are asking me to say is that arithmetic is a bad discipline and must be discarded.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Friedman, for being with us tonight. Senator Harmer.
Ladies and gentlemen, if the polls are correct, the one service that the people really want from the government is the ability to keep their own money in their pockets. And there is no doubt that you're not going to be able to rely upon the legislature to do it. Therefore, obviously, based upon the testimony you've heard tonight, we have but one recourse: the people to adopt a constitutional amendment that will limit the cost of state government.
Thank you. For those in our audience who may have joined us late, Senator Harmer and his witnesses have presented the case in favor of states adopting a constitutional amendment to limit state spending. And now for the case against. Mr. Miller, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Semerjian. Something very significant has happened here tonight. When the governor was asked what he would advise people if the ballot measure accurately states what this ballot is, he couldn't answer yes. And he is the major proponent of the measure. But the ballot measure does state the measure, and the ballot says probable offsetting tax increases to local government. What is really going on here? You know, we're all used to the slick salesman who promises us something for nothing, but you've got to read the fine print. And it's the fine print in this amendment. And what is the fine print? It's really not that complicated. At every point of the amendment, it requires a 2/3 vote to raise the income tax. And the income tax is overwhelmingly levied on those who earn more than $20,000 a year. And at every point, it only takes a majority vote to raise the sales or property tax for schools, which is levied on those who earn under predominantly $20,000 a year. What else? Professor Friedman couldn't give us the percentage, but 68.5% of the state budget is local assistance. Gets paid to local communities, most of it to schools. That is cut. The taxes will have to be picked up by the local taxes, again paid for by the average taxpayer. That's why the ballot initiative says probable substantial offsetting cost and tax increases to local government. Proponents here love to talk about special interest, as though somehow school children getting textbook were a special interest. Look at the income tax provision. There's only one special interest in this room tonight, those proposing this initiative. And fortunately, millions of Californians have seen that. And foremost among them is Speaker of the California Assembly, Bob Moretti.
Mr. Moretti, welcome to the Advocates.
Speaker Moretti, the proponents tell us that 44% of our tax dollars are being taken. What do you make of that statement?
Well, the legislative analyst points out the falsehood of that percentage. They have included about 12 different items that certainly are not taxes as part of taxes. For example, admissions to the University of California sporting events. For example, purchase of postage stamps, which is certainly not a tax. A tax is something you involuntarily pay and is extracted from you. The federal government sale of surplus goods is put down as a tax. That's not a tax. You raise the tax when you bought it in the first place. Secondly, they do not include undistributed corporate income. And the legislative analyst takes their figures apart and says, actually, it's 32%. And at that rate, the citizens of this country are the second lowest tax citizens of any industrial nation in the world.
Now, and most of that is federal tax anyway. Let's just look at the state portion. Could there have been a single tax measure or a single dollar of state money spent as to state taxes without the governor's approval?
No, the governor has signed every single budget for 7 years and every single appropriations measure. And don't be confused between the federal government and the state government. We cannot deficit spend in California. It is unconstitutional. You must remember that first. Secondly, we don't have something like a defense budget. Our monies go for support of education, health programs, the aged, blind, disabled, and children. That is the big chunk of state spending. And there is this sinister desire to mix it all up with what's going on in Washington. The governor of this state has said all of the fat has been cut out of this budget. That apparently means that what is left is needed. And the fact is, as you pointed out, more than 2/3 of our budget underwrites the property tax and is subvented to cities, counties, and school districts in California.
Well, tell me about the shift. If state expenditures cut, will that be a tax shift to the local taxes?
Well, it has to be. By definition, if you put an absolute maximum in the state constitution, the legislature has absolutely no ability to do anything about that. You have to make changes in statutory law. The cost of government will be forced down under the cities and counties and school districts, and that means to a large extent the property tax, which is the most unjust and most regressive of all taxes. And the less money you make, the harder it hits you.
Let's pick an example out of this amendment. Today, the legislature can give homeowners tax relief by paying special sums of money or exemptions simply to people who own homes and pay taxes on them. Will they be able to do so under this amendment?
No, because under this amendment, there must be an across-the-board property tax reduction. 70% of that amount would go to the business and commercial interests of the state of California. It is unlike the homeowners exemption and the renters relief that we have passed, which will directly reduce their taxes, but not so for business. If this passes, any property tax reduction, 70% of that amount will go to the commercial interests in the state of California.
The state government simply couldn't take $1 billion and give it for homeowners relief. $700 million of that would have to go to business as well.
That is correct.
And beside the effect on taxes, what does this do to the government structure of our state? Who does it give power to?
Well, what this does is it installs in our Constitution minority rule. 1/3 of the legislators in either house of the legislature will be in a position to totally control the state of California. As few as 14 members of the California State Senate, just over 10% of the entire membership of the legislature will be able to decide and direct the future and destiny of the state of California.
And you can imagine what the special interests will do with that.
I can imagine what they will do with that, and I don't think minority rule is what this country is all about.
Okay, Mr. Miller, let's see what questions Senator Harmer has.
Mr. Speaker, I gather from your testimony that you don't think Californians are paying 44% of their income in revenue to the government. Is that right?
That's right, Senator. You know that's
You're
right.
taking that from the legislative analyst. It's interesting that you take that figure from the legislative analyst
No,
who works
that's not
for you
just
and
from
me.
the legislative
But what
analyst,
about,
Senator.
may I finish the question, Mr. Speaker?
Well, is that one question? How many are you
No,
going to ask?
you'll hear the question. I'll be
Fine.
sure to tell you when it's finished. Mr. Speaker, the National Tax Foundation, who doesn't happen to work for you and me in the legislature, tells us that in fact this year the people of California are paying in excess of 40% of their income in taxes and more than 44% of their income in revenue to the government. Now, as opposed to the man you've been quoting who works for you and me in the legislature, why should the National Tax Foundation in New York, who have had a national reputation for being accurate on this matter, be less correct than our own legislative analyst, who's going to lose his job if you and me get unhappy with him?
Well, as a matter of fact, Senator, as a matter of fact, you have conveniently overlooked what the International Monetary Commission has pointed out, and they say, much closer to the legislative analyst, that Americans pay about 33% in taxes. But let's talk about the state of California.
Right.
That's what's going on.
Let's
right
talk
here.
about the state of California,
Fine.
Mr. Speaker. How much money do you think the people in California ought to pay in taxes? Are they paying too much now?
Well, as a matter of fact, the people of this state have control over that right now,
How about
Senator.
answering the question? Are they paying too much money in taxes or not, Mr. Speaker?
That is a decision they make. Are you telling me to
I
speak
want
for all of
your
the people of this
opinion.
state? I think I agree in this one instance with Governor Reagan, who says we need every dollar that's in that budget. We must, because he signed
Then you
that
don't
budget.
think we are paying too much in taxes.
For
How
the
much
state
would you
of
like
California?
us to pay?
No, because we only pay $3.1 billion for the state of
Okay.
California, as you well know, Senator.
You're telling me that right now our tax load isn't high enough. Tell me how much you'd like it to be, Mr.
Did
Speaker.
I say that? Excuse me. I didn't.
How much would you like it to be? Well, then, is it high enough? Is a state budget of $9.3 billion high enough for you, Mr. Speaker?
Well, the state share, as you know, is $3.1 billion of that, Senator. $6.2 billion goes to local support in this state, and the state is underwriting the property
Where does the state
tax
get
to
this
that
money?
amount.
Does it print it?
Well, of course not. You
It
know
gets
very
it
well
from the
where it
people,
gets it.
right?
Yes, yes,
Right.
that's right.
I guess you're not going to answer the question because you don't want to tell the people here, do you? That you don't believe they're being taxed enough money right now. Well, let's talk about another one of your
Well,
problems.
do I get to answer or not?
Yes, if you will. You may answer if you will answer, Mr. Speaker. Are we paying too much in taxes or not?
For support of the state of California, no.
We're not paying too much for the
No.
support of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now to your next point. You seem very worried about the emasculation of the legislative process by this proposition.
Aren't you?
No, I'm not, Mr. Speaker, and I'll tell you why. Because you and I just went through an experience where in 48 hours we sat in a legislative body that sent to this governor 750 pieces of legislation, many of them containing appropriations, and 95% of the people who voted for them had no idea what was in them. Why did they do it? Because they wanted to get on their vacation and they knew that the tyrant Mr. Miller referred to would take care of it. Does that sound like a legislative body that is frightened to death of being emasculated of its prerogatives?
Senator, you vote.
Go ahead, Mr. Moretti.
You voted for the state budget as I did. You voted for legislation last year as I did to put $1 billion of property tax reduction into the state of California, and you know it. We needed to give money to the schools. We needed to reduce the property tax, and both of us worked very hard for the passage.
Great speech, but nothing to do with the question. So
Well, it
let's talk
certainly
about
is.
the 70%.
It's the legislature's ability to deal with the problems
Let's talk
of the
about
state.
the 70%
One
of the
brief
property.
question, Senator Harmer.
The 70% of the property tax rebate that goes to business, about which you're so concerned. What does business do with the taxes it receives, Mr. Moretti? Does it pay them itself or pass them on to the people in increased costs?
Well, you know very well, Senator, because the oil companies have been reducing monies all along for the purchase of gasoline and oil. If they make whatever profit they can, and you know it.
You
Whatever
mean
the
that
market will bear is what they charge.
You mean, Mr. Speaker, then, that these oil companies have been absorbing this tax themselves?
No, what I mean is they will charge the public
Precisely.
whatever the public will bear, whatever
All
the
right.
public will pay.
All right.
That's why their profits are up 50%
Thank you,
this
Senator.
year.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Miller?
Mr. Speaker, with all the arguments over tax rates, it seems to me there's a very simple question. The California budget now is 8.5% of personal income. Could that budget have gone into effect unless Ronald Reagan also thought every tax and expenditure under it were necessary?
Absolutely not. He controls the Republicans in the legislature. He puts his name to that budget. He signed that $9.3 billion, and I assume he believes in it, or he wouldn't have signed it.
Could he have stricken out any single individual item or tax he thought was unnecessary?
Of course, he has the right to veto or blue pencil or whatever he likes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Miller. Let's go back to Senator Harmer.
Mr. Speaker, this year you authored legislation, you as the lead author, legislation which, according to this legislative analyst of whom you're so fond, would have cost the people of the state of California $277 million. If every member, you didn't know that? You seem surprised.
Would you tell me the bill number, Senator?
The 16 pieces of legislation which you introduced, and I have each of them here, of which you were the lead author, and you didn't even know that you introduced legislation that would cost nearly $300 million?
Oh, Senator, now you said a piece of legislation, didn't you?
A total legislative
Secondly,
package.
I authored the bill for $1 billion in property tax relief and school monies that the governor of this state signed and that you voted for.
We're not getting anywhere. One question.
Mr. Speaker, do you believe that the people of the state of California owe it to this legislature to be burdened with $300 million of increased services each year a new person becomes Speaker?
One very brief answer.
The people of this state elect the members of the legislature. If they want 120 like you or 120 like Ronald Reagan, they can elect them, but they haven't chosen to do that.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Moretti. Thank you. Mr. Moretti, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's also a man here who has had ample experience in controlling governmental expenditures and what they ought to be. The distinguished former governor of the state of California, Edmund G. Pat Brown.
Governor, welcome to the Advocates.
Governor Brown, I was intrigued by the response because it's really an illustration of what myth can do in politics. When you became governor, the state tax burden on the state was about 5% of personal income, and when you left the governorship, it was about 5.25% of personal income, the lowest increase of any governor in history.
That is true, and during the years from 59 to 66, California faced the highest mass migration in the history of the world. When I became governor in 1959, 200,000 more youngsters entered the elementary schools, and I had to anticipate 12 short years later that they'd be going to the university or the state colleges or the junior colleges of our state. We had to plan the growth of a great California water project. We had to have beaches and parks and freeways and highways to take care of them. We had one tax increase during the 8 years I was governor, one major tax increase. There were tax adjustments during that period of time. And I'm proud of that record.
You are proud of it, and all Californians are. And to illustrate where myth goes, the man who talks most about budget cutting and who wants this constitutional amendment has seen the percentage go to 8.5%. Do you begrudge that, or do you also think that's necessary?
No, I do not begrudge that. I think that Governor Reagan has made a real effort to cut the cost of government in California. And the principal reason that the budget has gone up to the extent that it has in California is because they have transferred some of the costs of local government to the state government, something that I wanted to do during the 8 years, but the priorities that we had did not permit it. But under this initiative measure that he's now proposing, this flexibility will no longer exist. You have to understand that we have three major units of taxation. You have the federal government, you have the state government, you have the local government. And to try to push it down here, you push it up here. There's no question about it at all. And to pass a prohibitory statute like the prohibition laws of the 1919, 1920s to try to rule a government by fiat is one of the most outrageous things I've ever heard. When I hear Senator Harmer questioning Bob Moretti, the Speaker, it's an attack upon representative government. The whole attack is upon the legislature.
And in fact, Governor, go ahead.
For 200 years in this country, we've had representative government. We haven't had a constitutional amendment such as this is proposed in any state in the Union or in the federal government. And the country's been run pretty good. I'm proud of America, and I don't think it's necessary to take away the powers of the legislature or representative government in the way that this is suggested.
The powers of the legislature. You've sat in the governor's chair. You've done this. Describe to us how easy it is if you have the will to hold down state spending. The governor has absolute power, doesn't he? How does he cut out items?
The governor of the state of California has a greater power than the President of the United States. We have one of the greatest budgetary systems in the entire United States. Is all you have to do is take a pencil and just draw a line through that pencil, and that item is out. And I don't believe in the history of the state of California has the legislature, which they have the power to do, ever overridden the budget of the state of California. For Governor Reagan to stand up here and make a statement that he inherited a bankrupt government is an outrageous statement, because in the state of California, under the Constitution, you must have a balanced budget. We did have a balanced budget. What he's referring to is the fact that we adopted accrual accounting during that period. That meant that at the end of this is what that most major corporations use, recommended to me by the certified public accountants of the country. The money that comes in, the money that goes out. You don't always pay the bills on July 1st because the money doesn't come in. You pay it later. And as a matter of fact, Governor Reagan fought.
All right, I'm going to have to interrupt you, Governor.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Let's go to Senator Harmer.
It is your faith to have...
Wait a minute, Mr. Miller. Wait a minute. Senator Harmer, your turn.
Governor Brown, we've appreciated your rewriting of history, but let's talk about one of those bills that you signed.
I don't think I have the power to rewrite history, Senator.
You happen to have signed one of those bills about which you were so proud, known as AB 59, which had to do with restructuring the whole welfare system of the state of California. Now, you made certain projections as to what that bill would cost the people of the state, relying upon our good legislative analysts, and both you and he were wrong. As it turned out, hundreds of millions of dollars in excess costs on welfare had to be spent, and it was only when Governor Reagan came into office and a welfare reform bill was signed that we got those 360,000 people off of the welfare rolls that he earlier mentioned. Now, my question to you is, Governor, do you feel that it was a mistake for the people of the state of California to revise that welfare program, to reduce those costs, to get those people off the welfare rolls?
I really can't say, and I don't think anybody can say as yet. Government, I only want government to leave me alone, to protect me by police powers. Government must help the indigent, the aged, and the poor, and the sick. And I don't know what's happened to those people. I haven't the power to determine whether or not the Governor Reagan's welfare bill is good or bad.
Well, Governor,
I know that some of his programs have hurt people. I know that his mental health programs have hurt people. I know they've hurt people. I know too, Senator, that if they had adopted the withholding tax in 1967, when he took over as governor, you wouldn't have had to increase the taxes of this state one iota. But he fought me on that during that campaign.
Gentlemen, I wonder if we could get back to the issue.
Very happy to get back to any issue you have.
Governor, you have referenced the halt, the aged, the blind, and those who are going to be denied certain services. Will you tell me how this proposition tonight is going to be so destructive to those needy people of the state of California?
Well, I have read the statements of Professor Friedman. I've read Governor Reagan's arguments. I've read the legislative analysts. The legislative analyst has been there under Governors Warren, Governor Knight, both Republicans, myself, and Governor Reagan. Now let me answer the question. Please don't interrupt me. I'm trying to answer your question. And as all I can say to you is that I think that the legislature over a period of years has done a mighty good job in the state of California, both Republicans and Democrats.
The question was, where in this proposition will these vital services to the needy be cut? You have not answered the question, and you can.
Well, I certainly can.
Then tell us,
if the legislative analyst is correct, and I don't know whether he is or not, I can't tell those figures. Professor Friedman says he's wrong. Bob Moretti says, and the legislative analyst says he's right. If you have to cut $650 million out of the California budget next year, and 2 and 3 years later down the line you have to cut $1.25 billion, somebody's going to be hurt. Please believe me. Either that or Governor Reagan has signed budget bills for the last 2 or 3 years. Maybe I was responsible for the first one. Maybe I was responsible for the second one. But for the last 5, he signed those budget bills. And if he thought that he could have cut that down, I know as an honorable man that he would have cut it down, but he can't do it. And right, no governor can, and you cannot put in the legislature.
Governor Brown, we'll have to accept your answer then. That as a matter of fact, it will be the legislature
that... Not. It's a fact.
Wait a minute, Governor. Let him ask the question.
Pardon? Isn't it true then that the effect of this proposition will be to force the legislature to decide what has the priority, where will the money be spent. Even you have had to admit, the proposition doesn't deny these people these services. It simply says, even if we stipulated for fact, which we do not, but for the sake of argument, that the analyst was right, isn't it really simply saying that the legislature must now decide within that budgetary limitation what's important and what isn't important, and then make their decision?
Why hasn't Governor Reagan done that during the past 3 years? Why hasn't he said to the legislature, wait a minute, let me finish my answer. Why hasn't he said to the legislature, I will only permit 7% of the income of this state to be spent by the legislature? The reason that he hasn't done it is because he can't do it. As a governor trying to do his job, he just can't do it. The legislative process, the budget process of the state...
Now, wait a minute, Senator.
Senator, the governor could do anything.
Senator Harmer, thank you very much. Senator,
I don't say he can do...
Senator, will you please sit down? Mr. Miller?
I don't say he can do
Governor,
anything,
you
but
haven't, no question's been put to you, Governor.
Okay.
You can talk when he's asking you a question. Governor Brown, in terms of where they'll be hurt, 68.5% of the state budget goes to local assistance and most of that to schools. Is there any way to have the kind of cuts the legislative analyst says is the effect of the measure without hurting local communities and schools?
The whole thrust of this measure is to put the tax burden on the local taxpayer. That's the theory of the economists represented by Professor Friedman and the people that have drafted this bill. They say they want property taxes. They admit it. They say that Governor Reagan does not. They say they disagree with him. These are the statements that have been made that I've heard about. These are hearsay statements, of course, but I've heard them. But if you ask Professor Friedman, he'll tell you that he wants the tax burden to be at the local level. They have what they call a foot economy, that if you don't like it, if you live in Los Angeles and the city council is bad, you can move from Los Angeles to Alhambra or maybe to some other city. This is their theory.
All right,
I just disagree with it.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Let's go back to Senator Harmer.
Governor Brown, you tell us you've read the proposition. You're aware of the fact that in Section 10A of the proposition, it allows the state to absorb any increase in this limitation if there is a corresponding decrease in property taxes. You're aware of that, are you not?
Senator Harmon, I've read this proposition 10 to 20 times, and I say that no one knows what this proposition will do, and it'll create financial chaos in the state of California. That's what I say.
Governor Brown, let me be the first to tell you that in fact Section 10A provides just that the state can absorb any time it wishes to do so an increase in this limit if it decreases these property taxes about what you're so concerned. Now the question, Governor Brown, under this proposition, within 16 years, the amount of money available for our state budget will triple. Can't you believe that even the state of California can run its affairs on $27 billion a year?
Those projections are as false as the statement that the California taxpayer pays 44% of his income in taxes. That is absolutely untrue. What you are considering is that we'll have the same growth rate in the universities and the state colleges. We'll have the same welfare rate. We'll have the same tax increases that have happened over the past 20 years.
Which is
all right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Governor. Thank you.
Who can project out 15 years?
Gentlemen, thank you, Governor, for being with us tonight. Governor, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. That completes the cases. And now, Mr. Miller, will you please present your closing argument?
Thank you, Mr. Semerjian. It sounds complicated, but I think you really can focus in on it. What does the amendment necessarily provide? The official ballot measure says so, offsetting tax increases to local government. Why? Because you must cut local assistance, mostly to schools, and when you do, who's going to pick it up? The property taxpayer. What is the responsibility of those who govern? It is to talk. Is it to talk about cutting taxes and propose an amendment and then sign the highest state budget in history and say you were forced to? Of course not. The governor could have held spending down to 7% if he wished to, and he did not. The responsibility of government is to raise money for the people's needs and to tax fairly. This amendment does neither. It cuts the people's needs, taxes unfairly. Not a blessing, but a curse. On this amendment, the vote is no.
Okay, Senator Harmer, your closing argument, please.
You have heard arguments tonight on three basic points. The first is the total cost of government, and even the opponents here tonight would not argue that the present cost of government is reasonable. And secondarily, we've heard absolutely no testimony tonight that would lead us to believe that either the Congress or the state legislatures are going to be able to discipline themselves financially. That leaves us one final issue. Is this proposition a valid solution to this real problem? Now, the opponents tell us that we will bury local government in unknown costs. And yet the proposition, even if Governor Brown can't understand it, very clearly makes it plain that the state, at any time it wishes to do so, may absorb those increased costs to local government and shift that cost to the taxpayer. This brings us to the real opposition. That is the fear of the opponents of this proposition, to put in the hands of the local people the right to say how much government will cost them and for what reason. I urge you to vote yes for this proposition. Join Governor Reagan and Milton, Friedman, and myself in seeing to it that we return to a rational government.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's now time for you and our audience to get involved. What do you think about the subject we've debated tonight? Should your state adopt a constitutional amendment to limit state spending? Send your yes or no vote on a letter or postcard to the Advocates, Box 1973, Boston 02134. Today, the issue is before the state of California, and tomorrow it may be before your state. And as we've said, this device of limiting state spending is proposed as a model for the federal government. So let's hear from you in California and elsewhere, and we'll tabulate your views and make them known to state governments and to Congress. Remember the address, the Advocates, Box 1973, Boston 02134. If you'd like a complete transcript of tonight's debate, send your request to the same address, the Advocates, Box 1973, Boston 02134, and enclose a check or money order for $2 to cover the cost of printing and mailing. You should get your copy within 3 weeks of our receiving your request, and be sure to specify the program by name and your return address. Now, recently, the Advocates debated the question, does executive privilege justify the president's withholding of the Watergate tapes? Of the more than 3,600 viewers who sent us their votes, 30% said yes, executive privilege does justify withholding of the tapes, and 70% said no, it does not justify it. And now let's look ahead to next week's program.
Wage and price control are an indispensable part of any economic policy that this country can have, and we certainly, I hope, will not again pay attention to the people who are offering us this dream of the free market.
Should we end all wage and price controls now? A question next time on The Advocates.
And now, with thanks to our advocates and their very able and distinguished witnesses, we conclude tonight's debate.
The Advocates as a program takes no position on the issues debated tonight. Our job is to help you understand both sides more clearly. This program was recorded.